In the late fall of 1950, American leaders were confident. The Korean War seemed all but won. United Nations forces had driven deep into North Korea, and the maps on their briefing tables glowed with optimism. The word from the top was clear: victory by Christmas. The enemy, they were told, was shattered, broken, and in full retreat. It was an assumption that would lead an entire army to the brink of annihilation. Deep in the northeastern corner of the Korean peninsula, there was a place few had ever heard of, the Chosin Reservoir. It wasn't a city or a strategic fortress. It was a massive man-made lake, walled in by towering mountains, treacherous narrow roads, and some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. As winter descended, it transformed into a frozen hell. Temperatures plunged to 30 degrees below zero. Metal became brittle, weapons froze solid, and vehicle engines refused to start. In this cold, a wound wasn't just an injury. It was a death sentence, with frostbite and shock claiming lives in minutes. The cold wasn't just a condition of the battle, it was an enemy in itself. Into this frozen landscape marched the elite U.S. 1st Marine Division, supported by Army and Allied units. They were seasoned veterans, confident in their mission: push north, secure the final stretch of territory, and bring the war to a close. But they were marching into a trap. Unknown to them, a colossal force of over 120,000 Chinese soldiers had already crossed the Yalu River. They moved in absolute silence, without radios or vehicles, traveling only under the cover of darkness. They were a ghost army, and they were waiting. On the night of November 27, 1950, the illusion of an easy victory was violently shattered. All at once, the Chinese forces struck. They swarmed out of the mountains, hitting the American positions from every conceivable direction. The haunting sound of bugles echoed through the frozen valleys, a signal for a massive, coordinated assault. Flares shot into the sky, illuminating a terrifying scene. Thousands upon thousands of enemy soldiers charging across the snow. Suddenly, the Marines were locked in desperate, hand-to-hand combat in the pitch-black cold, fighting for their lives on isolated, frozen hillsides. One by one, entire units were cut off, surrounded. The reality was horrifying. The Americans were no longer attacking. They were encircled. The commanders on the ground quickly grasped the terrible truth. This wasn't a disorganized, retreating enemy. This was a meticulously planned offensive, designed with one goal: to encircle and annihilate every UN soldier in the mountains. Supply lines were severed. The few roads that existed were blocked. Radio communication was sporadic and unreliable. The order that finally came down was brutally simple: fight your way out. What happened next was not a retreat. It was a fighting withdrawal, an epic of survival that would be seared into the annals of military history. The Marines and soldiers began a slow, agonizing push south. But this wasn't a retreat. It was an attack in a new direction. To move south, they often had to advance north, fighting tooth and nail to break through Chinese roadblocks. Every single hill along the route had to be taken by force before the column could pass. Every convoy carrying the wounded and essential supplies was under constant, relentless fire. The human cost was staggering. Frostbite was as deadly as the enemy, claiming fingers, toes, and entire limbs. Morphine, essential for the wounded, froze solid inside syringes. Blood plasma turned to useless slush. The dead were frozen where they fell, becoming silent, icy statues along the side of the road. And yet, through it all, discipline never broke. The command structure held. The fighting spirit endured. When a reporter asked the Marine commander, General Oliver P. Smith, how his men would escape the encirclement, he gave an answer that would become legendary. Retreat? Hell, we're not retreating. We're just advancing in a different direction. Moments of incredible heroism defined the breakout. At Tok Tong Pass, a single company of Marines held a vital mountain choke point against overwhelming Chinese attacks for 5 grueling days. If they had failed, the thousands of men behind them would have been trapped and destroyed. They held their ground. At the makeshift command post of Hagaru-ri, engineers performed a miracle. Under constant enemy fire, they carved a functioning airstrip out of the frozen rocky ground using little more than hand tools and sheer determination. This airstrip became a lifeline, allowing the most critically wounded to be evacuated and essential supplies to be flown in. Without that runway, the division would have bled out in the snow. Perhaps the most astonishing feat of ingenuity occurred when the column discovered a critical bridge had been blown up, severing their only escape route over a deep gorge. With no way around, it seemed the end. But the solution came not from the ground, but from the sky. In a daring operation, U.S. Air Force planes flew through enemy fire to airdrop massive, prefabricated bridge sections. On the ground, in sub-zero temperatures and under attack, engineers scrambled to assemble the bridge, piece by agonizing piece. They reopened the road south. It was a masterpiece of improvisation under the most extreme pressure imaginable. For 17 days, the surrounded forces fought, they moved, they froze, and they bled. But they refused to break. When the exhausted survivors of the 1st Marine Division finally reached the port of Hungnam, they were not a defeated army. They had fought their way through 11 Chinese divisions, inflicting catastrophic casualties on the enemy. They brought out their wounded, their dead, and nearly all of their heavy equipment. They had walked out of a trap that was designed to erase them from existence. Strategically, the Chinese had won a victory by forcing the UN out of North Korea, but they had failed in their primary objective, the complete destruction of the American forces at Chosin. The Americans had survived, and in doing so, they had forged a legacy. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir became a defining moment for the U.S. Marine Corps and the American military. It was a testament to the power of discipline in the face of chaos, of leadership under impossible pressure, and of the unbreakable will of soldiers who refused to be beaten. The veterans of Chosin would all say the same thing. They didn't survive because the conditions were good or because the odds were in their favor. They survived because they refused to abandon each other, and they refused to break. They were surrounded, they were outnumbered, but they were never, ever broken. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as powerful as we did, please consider subscribing for more chapters from history.